You're watching Simply Stories, where truth shakes the ground beneath arrogance. Today's story: HOA demanded $350,000 from a black man's inherited ranch. Didn't know they built on his land. Buckle up, because when power forgets its place, justice draws the line. Make sure to subscribe for more real drama turned on its head. The sun rose gently over the rolling hills of the countryside as he stepped onto the porch of the ranch he'd recently inherited. The morning air was crisp, laced with the scent of pine and dry earth. This land had been in his family for generations. Passed down to him by his late grandfather, wasn't just acres and fences, it was history. A place where old boots still sat by the door, where weathered barn walls held the echoes of childhood summers, hard labor, and quiet wisdom. He had come here seeking peace, a slower rhythm of life, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to reconnect with his roots. Days passed as he threw himself into the work. He repaired broken fences, cleared overgrown brush, and patched up the aging sheds. There was something deeply satisfying about the solitude. The hands-on effort, the feeling of building something solid from the ground up. He'd wake before dawn, pour black coffee into a tin mug, and get to work under open skies. With only the hum of cicadas and the occasional bark of a distant dog keeping him company, it was honest, grounding, and it felt right. But everything changed with a single envelope. One afternoon, he found a formal-looking letter wedged between junk mail and his rusted mailbox. The return address belonged to a local homeowners association, one he'd never heard of. He opened it casually at first, expecting maybe a mistake or some community announcement. But as his eyes scanned the bolded words, his heart dropped. The letter demanded payment, $350,000 in accumulated fines, late dues, and penalties. They claimed his property, the ranch his grandfather had lived on his entire life, was now within their HOA boundaries. According to them, his land was subject to their regulations. Even though no one had ever told him and no one had ever asked. At first he thought it had to be a clerical error. Surely someone had mixed up parcels or addresses. Determined to clear things up, he drove into town the next morning and made his way to the HOA office, tucked inside a pristine building surrounded by trimmed hedges and paved parking lots. The receptionist barely looked up when he entered, but after waiting nearly half an hour, he was finally ushered into a small meeting room. There, he was met by a trio of HOA board members, all dressed in identical navy suits and forced smiles. They didn't offer him a seat. They didn't ask about his situation. Instead, they spoke at him, coldly, confidently, like he was just another case number. When he explained who he was and where he lived, one of them raised an eyebrow and said, "You really should have read the community covenant before moving in." Another chimed in, "We've sent notices for years." Ignorance isn't an excuse. He tried to remain calm. He told them that his grandfather had owned the ranch long, before any gated communities popped up nearby, that no one in his family had ever agreed to join an HOA, that their roads didn't run through his property, and their signs didn't mark his gates. He didn't live in their development, he lived beside it, separate and proud. But they didn't care. They claimed his land had been absorbed by an expanded jurisdiction years ago, that he now owed fees for street maintenance, community security, landscaping services he never asked for and never used. The conversation grew tense. When he pressed them for legal proof, they shrugged and said it was all in the system. One even suggested that if he couldn't pay, foreclosure might be the only path forward. They said it with an unsettling calm, like this was just business. Like they hadn't just threatened to take everything from him. He left the building with his fists clenched and his jaw tight. The drive back to the ranch felt different. Now every mile seemed heavier, every tree and fence post shadowed by doubt. That night, under the dim light of a bare bulb in his grandfather's study, he began to search. He pulled down old boxes from dusty shelves. He opened drawers that hadn't been touched in years. Inside, he found worn manila folders, hand-drawn maps, newspaper clippings, and yellowed deeds with curled edges and fading ink. One folder in particular caught his eye. It was labeled simply with the year. His grandfather had purchased the final piece of land that completed the ranch. Inside was a full survey of the property, complete with boundary lines, plot numbers, and legal coordinates. It was meticulous, thorough, and very clearly showed something troubling. The land the HOA now claimed was already his. Not just overlapping, not disputed. He sat back in the creaky leather chair and exhaled slowly. Something wasn't right. Someone was lying or hiding something. And deep down, he knew this wasn't just about money. It was about intimidation, control, maybe even the assumption that he wouldn't fight back, that he'd fold quietly and walk away like so many before him might have done. But they didn't know the man his grandfather had raised. And they certainly didn't know what this land meant not just to him, but to the legacy it stood for. He looked out the window, past the rusted windmill and the cracked water trough, into the starlit stretch of fields beyond. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The wind rustled through the trees as night settled over the ranch. And inside the small office, once used by his grandfather, the man sat surrounded by dust-covered boxes and brittle paper. He had been at it for hours, sorting, reading, cross-referencing. A thin layer of grit clung to his hands, but he didn't stop. Something deep inside urged him to keep digging, and when he opened one particular box tucked behind an old filing cabinet, his neat breath caught. Inside were maps, old ones, faded but precise, along with letters from county officials. Notarized deeds and official surveys, each one carefully preserved and marked with his grandfather's handwriting. This wasn't just paperwork. It was a record, a shield, a silent testimony from a man who had clearly known how to protect what was his. He spread the documents across the desk, aligning them with a modern satellite printout he'd pulled up on his tablet. His eyes scanned the lines, measured the coordinates, and then he saw it. The development, the polished streets, the tennis court, the tall clubhouse with its marble entrance. Even several rows of luxury homes. They weren't just near the boundary. They were on it, or rather, over it. A large section of what the HOA claimed as their community had spilled past its designated limit, right onto the land that had always belonged to his grandfather. It wasn't just a few feet. It was nearly 10 acres. The silence in the room grew heavy. The implications unraveled fast in his mind. Not only had they tried to bully him into paying fines for land they had no right to govern, but they had also expanded illegally, built lavish structures, and sold homes on land that wasn't even theirs. And worse, based on the dates in the documents, this wasn't recent. It had started years ago, slowly and deliberately. The HOA hadn't stumbled across a boundary. They had crossed it knowing the risk. And for years they had gotten away with it. The next morning he drove to the county clerk's office. The receptionist seemed surprised by the pile of records he brought, but within minutes, a senior staff member came out to meet him. Together, they reviewed every line, every stamp, every historical map. It took hours, but by the end, there was no doubt left. The official pointed to a satellite overlay and nodded grimly. The HOA was not just in error, they were deep in violation. A development of that scale crossing into privately owned ranch land without consent was more than a mistake. It was a legal disaster waiting to be exposed. Still, he wanted absolute confirmation. So he hired a private surveyor, an independent expert, with no ties to the HOA, the county, or local real estate developers. Within a week, the man returned with his report. He didn't hesitate. "They've built all over your property," he said. "Tennis courts, utility lines, a chunk of that clubhouse parking lot, and 5 homes at least." 8. The surveyor paused, then added, "This isn't an oversight. This was a gamble. They were hoping nobody would ever notice." That evening, calm and steady, he returned to the HOA office, this time during their public board meeting. The room was filled with residents, board members, and polite refreshments on a folding table no one touched. He waited his turn, then stepped forward with a stack of evidence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply laid out the facts: his grandfather's deed, the original county surveys, the modern surveyor's findings. Then he handed copies to the board. For a moment, the room was silent. One board member flipped through the documents with forced nonchalance, then gave a tight smile. "This is all very dramatic," she said. "But I think you've misunderstood what you're reading. Our attorneys have reviewed these plots thoroughly. If there's an issue, it's likely with the maps themselves, or perhaps the surveyor's methods." Another board member leaned forward, squinting. "You're not seriously accusing us of building an entire community on someone else's land? Are you? That would be absurd." He stood his ground. He didn't argue. He just repeated what the document said. The board shuffled papers and avoided eye contact. One man sitting at the far end of the table muttered under his breath, "Not," realizing his mic was still hot. "I told you this would happen if someone ever inherited that damn ranch." The room froze. Eyes turned. The man who had spoken quickly shut off his mic, but the damage was done. The implication was clear. They had known, or at least suspected, for years. That was why they came after him so hard. Not to enforce DAWs, but to silence a threat. They had gambled that his grandfather would die quietly, that the land would remain untouched or be sold off blindly. They never imagined someone would come back, someone who would care enough to fight. He looked around the room, watching the expressions change from dismissal to discomfort. But still, they didn't apologize. They didn't acknowledge the truth. They told him they'd have their legal team take a closer look and escorted him out like a minor inconvenience. But he wasn't angry, not visibly, because now the truth wasn't buried in old boxes anymore. It was documented, confirmed, and alive. On the drive home, he didn't feel defeat. He felt something else, something steady and rising. They had tried to intimidate him with power, money, and polished buildings. But what they didn't realize was that legacy ran deeper than blueprints, and truth didn't fade with time. Land had a voice now, and he was ready to let it speak. The air felt heavier that morning. Like the land itself was waiting for what came next. He had moved in silence long enough. After confirming every boundary, validating every document, and giving the HOA more chances than they deserved, he made his move. He hired a lawyer, quiet, firm, and sharp hand together. They filed a cease and desist order backed by every legal right attached to the land. It wasn't just about reclaiming what was his. It was about drawing a line that had already been crossed for far too long. And this time, the message wouldn't come in envelopes or polite warnings, it would come with fences, steel posts, and county-backed enforcement. The next day, workers arrived at dawn. They moved quickly and with purpose. Trucks unloaded wooden, posts, chains, and warning signs. By noon, new fencing cut straight through a section of what the HOA had claimed as community space. It sliced through the corner of a manicured park, lined with benches and lavender bushes. It boxed in a row of tall trees, shading a walking path. And perhaps most noticeably, it blocked off nearly a third of the HOA's pristine clubhouse parking lot. Residents began emerging from their homes, watching from porches and sidewalks, murmuring among themselves. Some called the HOA office in confusion. Others simply stared, trying to understand how someone could just arrive and shut down pieces of their polished world. Security guards were dispatched almost immediately. 2 of them approached the fence line, trying to stop the crew from installing the final section. One stepped forward, demanding they halt construction immediately. But the man stepped in, pulled a rolled document from a folder, and handed it to them. The guards read in silence, "Sheriff-approved cease and desist," supported by official survey data and property ownership records. It was clear this wasn't a dispute anymore. This was enforcement. The guards, after a short radio call, stepped back and let the crew finish. Panic rippled through the community. In the days that followed, emergency HOA meetings were held behind closed doors. The emails went out, filled with vague language and corporate tone. Property matters under review, temporary access changes, ongoing resolution processes. But residents weren't buying it. Some were furious that their clubhouse parking was gone, that their evening strolls now ended at metal gates. Someone they'd barely seen now had more power than their own board. Others, quieter and more curious, began asking questions. How could this have happened? Why hadn't the board said anything sooner? And more importantly, how long had they known? Rumors spread quickly. Some said he was trying to bankrupt the HOA. Others claimed he was planning to sell the land back to them for millions. A few whispered that he was just doing it for revenge, but none of that mattered when the local news picked up the story. It began as a short segment on a rural land dispute. A rancher defending inherited property from a wealthy HOA, but the angle changed when the footage aired. Clear signs of encroachment, historical documents, and drone shots showing homes and amenities built deep into ranch land. The segment went viral overnight. Suddenly, the man who'd once been dismissed as a troublemaker became something else, a symbol of standing up to power. Social media lit up with comments. Some called him a hero, others a threat to the HOA system entirely. Legal experts chimed in, dissecting land laws, survey lines, and property rights. But the real shift came when an anonymous source leaked a chain of internal HOA emails. In them, board members acknowledged as far back as 5 years ago that a boundary concern existed. One email warned that the ranch may legally still hold portions of this land. Another suggested quietly negotiating with the old man who once owned it, but that never happened. And in the final email, someone wrote bluntly, "We'll deal with it if it ever becomes a problem. Odds are, there won't be an heir." Was the spark. Residents, armed with this new knowledge, demanded answers. They packed board meetings, confronted leadership in lobbies, and called for resignations. The narrative the HOA tried to spin, that he was greedy, that he wanted to extort them, fell apart in public. Because now the evidence showed that greed had lived in the HOA's own halls for years. They had gambled with other people's investments, sold homes on shaky ground, and hoped no one would come to collect. Meanwhile, he remained quiet. He didn't give interviews, didn't post online. He kept working the ranch. Every time a reporter showed up at the gate, he politely declined. He didn't need to tell his side. The land was telling it for him. And in the growing storm, silence became its own kind of power. The same silence they once used to ignore him now turned against them. Residents began filing their own legal claims, some against the board, others looking to pull out of contracts. Real estate values dipped. Potential buyers backed out. Insurance companies started asking hard questions, and the board. They scrambled. One member resigned. Another went dark, deleting their social media and moving out of town. None of that mattered anymore. The truth was out. The storm had come. And the man at the center of it all never raised his voice or swung a hammer. Literally, mediation was held in a quiet, glass-walled conference room downtown. Far from the dirt roads and cedar trees that surrounded the ranch, but even in that sterile space of polished tables and clipped voices, the land had a presence. Its boundaries had been measured, its documents authenticated, and now its worth would be defined not by the arrogance of a board, but by the law. The man sat at one end of the room with his legal team to calm. Sharp attorneys who spoke with the confidence of undeniable evidence. Across from them sat the HOA's lawyers, visibly tense, their thick binders filled not with leverage, but with damage control. When negotiations began, the man's team was clear. They weren't interested in vague promises or drawn-out corrections. They were demanding a full buyout of the encroached land, priced at current market value, not discounted, not negotiated. Every acre, every square foot. The calculations were methodical. The illegal development had spread across nearly 10 acres, including parts of valuable infrastructure, clubhouse access, homes, and recreational land. The total value, once appraised and adjusted for location, utility access, and property enhancements, came to over $2.5 million. The HOA team flinched. It was over 7 times the original $350,000 they had tried to fine him. Now they were the ones facing a bill. There were whispered phone calls, urgent side conversations, and one visibly sweating board member who excused himself from the room and didn't return. The truth was simple. They didn't have the money. Not without gutting their reserve funds, slashing budgets, or asking homeowners to cover the loss. But the man didn't budge, because unlike them, he had nothing to lose and everything to defend. Word of the mediation outcome spread like wildfire. The settlement wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. The HOA, faced with a mountain of evidence, and the rising fury of its own residents, agreed to pay. Some payments came from their insurance policy. Others came from emergency board allocations. The rest would come from loans, homeowner assessments, and painful sacrifices. The arrogance that once filled their newsletters and board meetings had vanished. In its place was silence, resignation, and a bitter acceptance of reality. Board members began stepping down. The ones who had pushed the hardest for fines, who had publicly dismissed the man's claims, now faced their own consequences. A group of residents filed a joint civil suit against them for negligence, deception, and breach of fiduciary duty. Depositions were scheduled, deposits were pulled, trust was broken. And in a quiet neighborhood once obsessed with manicured lawns, in monthly dues, the true cost of pride began to bloom like a crack through concrete. But the man didn't watch from a distance. He didn't gloat or celebrate. Instead, he turned his focus to something more lasting. With a portion of the settlement money, he established a free legal aid fund specifically for rural landowners. Dealing with harassment, boundary disputes, or intimidation by overreaching developers and associations, he didn't put his name on it. He didn't hold a press conference. He simply hired a small team of lawyers, gave them a mission, and let them do what they were built to do: protect people who didn't have the time or money to fight back alone. Letters began arriving from across the state: ranchers, farmers, elderly homeowners thanking him for something he never publicly took credit for. His story became a quiet legend in those circles, not because he had one, but because he had stood firm without becoming cruel, because he had held his ground with facts, not fire, because he reminded people that legacy isn't always about inheritance. Sometimes it's about resolve. As for the ranch, it remained untouched. The fences stayed. The gates were repaired. He tore down the old sheds and replaced them with a small barn and a solar-powered workshop. Grass grew back where the clubhouse parking lot once pushed in. The trees near the path he reclaimed began to blossom again in the spring. Wildlife returned. It was as if the land itself had been waiting to exhale. He spent more time outdoors, not because he needed to protect it anymore, but because it finally felt like home. His home. One morning, long after the headlines faded and the HOA's reputation sank beneath the surface, he saddled his horse just after dawn. The sky stretched wide above him, streaked with soft blue and pale orange. The land, now fully his and no longer under threat, opened before him like a living map of memory and justice. He rode quietly along the fence line, past the creek his grandfather used to fish, past the stretch of earth where strangers once laid down stone without asking. There were no cameras now, no audience, just the sound of hooves, wind, and the faint rustle of branches in the breeze. In that moment, he wasn't thinking of lawsuits or settlements or board meetings. He was thinking of the weight of a key in his hand, the warmth of soil beneath his boots, and the power of silence that speaks louder than outrage. Justice hadn't been bought. It had been reclaimed, inch by inch, line by line, with every page of proof and every refusal to back down. And now, as the sun rose over the hills and the ranch stood quiet in its victory, he finally exhaled. Because this wasn't just a win, it was a return, a reckoning, a reminder that some roots run too deep to be paved over.